I don't know about you, but whenever I hear the word aerodrome, I think of Billy Bishop and the Red Baron and planes like this. But it turns out that aerodrome is a standard term in the aviation business and plays a particularly big role in the new drone regulations. So I thought I would devote an entire video to explaining aerodromes and related terminology, all of which is crucial for you to get through your 2019 Canadian pilot exams and to fly safely. So let's begin by understanding the official definition of an aerodrome. Aerodrome is actually defined in the Canadian Aeronautics Act and can also be found in the AIM document, the Aeronautical Information Manual. An aerodrome means any area of land, water, including the frozen surface thereof, or other supporting surface used, designed, prepared, equipped, or set aside for use either in whole or in part for the arrival, departure, movement, or servicing of aircraft, and includes any buildings, installations, and equipment situated thereon or associated therewith. I love the word therewith. But what does this mean? It means that an aerodrome is any place used to land, take off, or service an aircraft. So obviously this is an aerodrome, and so is this, but so is this, and even this. So if any grassy field, straight stretch of road or lake is an aerodrome, doesn't this mean that as drone operators, we're in a lot of trouble trying to stay away from all these things? Well, as it turns out, that's not the case. Let's go through and understand the different flavors of aerodromes before we panic. So to help with this story, I'm going to bring along three little friends of mine. The first is the Canada Flight Supplement, or CFS, which defines all the registered and certified aerodromes, ground-based. And then his little brother, the Water Aerodrome Supplement. I think you can figure out what that is. And finally, their distant cousin, the Designated Airspace Handbook, or DAH. Whoever does this one needs to work on their cover art. Between these three characters, we will be able to walk through all of the airspace and aerodrome information in Canada. So using the information in those three documents, as well as a rather in-depth conversation with a Transport Canada representative, I put together this nice, neat table. Now it's rather dense, but I think once we get into it, you'll see that it is fairly logical and ordered and not all that complicated to understand. At the top of the heap is controlled airspace, arguably a tie with restricted, but we'll start with controlled. Controlled airspace is airspace that is controlled by an airport, typically an air traffic control tower. You can identify it in the DAH because it's either Class C or Class D, starting at the surface and working your way upwards in altitude. There are lots of other classes of airspace in the controlled airspace category, but from a droning perspective, you're only interested in the ones relatively close to the ground. Basic operations, you must stay out of controlled airspace. If you have an advanced operations in effect, amongst the other regulations associated with controlled airspace, you must get permission from the authorized owner of that airspace, who you can determine from the Flight Information Center, the FIC. Here's an example of a controlled airspace. You can see it's rather complicated in terms of its identification with latitudes and longitudes and distances and angles and all this kind of stuff. And this is why it's best to rely upon an official map, such as the UAV Site Selector, or an app, which, as I've mentioned in one of my other videos, I'm working on with another colleague. The second location or area in the hierarchy of life of Canadian airspace is restricted airspace. Restricted airspace is very similar to controlled airspace, except it's controlled by a facility or an organization other than an airport. So there's no control tower, for example. In the DAH, restricted airspace is identified as Class F. And again, basic operations, you must stay out. With advanced operations, obviously you don't contact the FIC, you contact the facility in question or the location in question and get permission from them. Here's an example of a penitentiary in Ontario. Hey, it's Joyceville. Cool name. Maybe that's where I'm broadcasting from right now. Well, no, I'm not. So in this case, you can see that there is a designated authority. It's the warden of the prison, and there's his number, his or her number. The third area in the hierarchy is military aerodromes. And they're more or less tied again with airports, but they have bigger guns, so I put them ahead. Military aerodromes are any sort of aerodrome that is operated by the military, also known as DND, Department of National Defense. In the Canadian Flight Supplement, you can identify aerodromes that are military aerodromes because they say DND in the operations area of their listing. Basic operations, you must stay 3 nautical miles away, or 5.6 kilometers. I've just used nautical miles all the way through here because it's a little more compact. In advanced operations, you actually need not only permission from the head of the military facility that you're trying to approach, but you also need a full-on SFOC, Special Flight Operations Certificate. Next, airports. Airports are arguably I'll say the anchor of this whole thing. Airports here are actual certified airports, and that is a critical thing to understand and get your head around. Not everything that has an airplane landing at it with a runway is an airport. You're only an airport if you are certified. So how can you tell if an airport is certified? Well, in the CFS, it's listed with the word CERT, or the abbreviation CERT, in its operating section of the listing. Basic operations, you must stay 3 nautical miles away. If it's an advanced operations, you have to follow the operator's procedures. OPR stands for operator, by the way. You have to follow the operator procedures for that airport. Now, it's a little tricky because a lot of airports don't actually have established procedures. So in that case, and in any case, you need to contact the airport using the operator information in the CFS, ask what their procedure is, and work it out from there. Here's an example of an airport that is a certified airport. You can see that it says CERT, and you can see the number to call to secure permission. Heliports, very similar to airports, just a little smaller. Again, heliports come in 2 flavors, regular and certified. Certified heliports are identified with a CERT in the CFS, and they're identified as heliports because they say heli in their title or in the operations area. Basic operations, you only need to stay 1 nautical mile away, and in advanced operations, it's exactly the same as airports. You contact the operator of the heliport and you follow their established procedures. If they don't have established procedures, you talk to them and make sure that you're following their instructions. By the way, the abbreviation PPR that you see in the CFS is short for Prior Permission Required, which is self-explanatory. After certified airports and heliports, things go, I'll say, a lot simpler. So registered aerodromes or heliports are aerodromes or heliports that are listed in the CFS but are not certified. They're listed just with a reg, or short for registered, in the CFS, and of course they don't say CERT in their listing. In this case, for a registered aerodrome or heliport that is not certified, it's in the CFS but it's not certified, the only requirement, aside from staying out of the way of manned aircraft, is to stay out of established aircraft traffic patterns, so landing patterns and things like that. Fairly simple, not all that restrictive, in fact. Water aerodromes are very similar. Water aerodromes obviously are aerodromes on the water, or in the winter on ice, for seaplanes. Water aerodromes are listed in one document called the WAS, which we've talked about, and they are listed with a reg for registered in that WAS. As far as Transport Canada, or the contact I was talking to, was concerned, he didn't think that you could actually certify a water aerodrome. That said, some water aerodromes are actually part and parcel of airports. They're adjacent to them, and in those cases the airport itself is certified, so the water aerodrome may or may not actually fall under that same certification. Like registered aerodromes and heliports, for water aerodromes all you need to do is stay out of aircraft traffic patterns. Pretty simple. And then we get to the bottom of the list, and this is any other aerodrome. And if you recall from the definition, this can be any place that you can land or take off with an aircraft. And this row is reserved for aerodromes that are not certified, they're not registered in the CFS, and they're not in the WAS. Okay, so that's how you know that you're looking at one of those guys. And there's lots of these. These are private, in addition to the sort of random landing on a lake, for example. There are plenty of private facilities on farms where they've cleared a field for ultralights or whatever. There's lots of those around. But you do not have to stay away from them like the 3 nautical mile thing of regular airports. All you have to do from the new drone regulations is to stay out of the way of manned aircraft. Now, that rule applies in all of these cases, in addition to the more detailed information I've listed here. In every case, you have to stay out of the way and give way to manned aircraft at all times. So that's the hierarchy of life in Canadian airspace. Starts with controlled airspace and restricted airspace, goes through a hierarchy of airports down through to aerodromes where anyone and his brother is landing or taking off. By the way, I will be incorporating this handy table into an update to the study guide that I've prepared for the pilot exams. And if you've already purchased that PDF copy from me, you'll receive notification by email of your free opportunity to receive that update. And if you haven't already taken a look into the study guide, I encourage you to do so. There's a link in the description below this video. So let's look at the individual instructions, and I'll do this fairly quickly because we've kind of covered the basics here, but the individual regulations that drive this interpretation. So the first one is 901.14 related to controlled or restricted airspace. And again, it says, and this is my interpretation as you could see it in the Droner's Guide to the 2019 Canadian RPAS regulations. I hope you've watched that video series. Operations in controlled airspace must be carefully controlled. Sorry about my strange wording here. It's an advanced operation. You need authorization to fly in any controlled airspace. And again, we've talked about whether that be through the FIC or through the designated authority in the case of Class F. Class F airspace is restricted and requires authorization from specific organizations. And the designated airspace handbook defines all these locations. All right, 901.14. When flying near airports and heliports, this is covered by Regulation 901.73. And in this case, as I said on the previous pages, if you're flying an advanced operation and you're within 3 nautical miles of an airport or 1 nautical mile of a heliport, you must follow the procedures applicable to that airport or heliport. And in general, operations near aerodromes, you must not interfere with an aircraft in an established traffic pattern when you're near any aerodrome that's in the CFS or WAS. And if you're flying near an airport or heliport, it's an advanced operation within those ranges, and you need an SFOC to fly within 3 nautical miles of a military aerodrome, excuse me. So with the new regulations coming up, and maybe by the time you're listening to this, they're already upon us, let's understand the impact of these changes that are starting on June the 1st, 2019, because it's actually rather profound in some cases. So here's the hierarchy of life as I've had it before. The restrictions prior to June 1st, 2019 were that you basically had to stay out of controlled airspace or restricted airspace unless you had an SFOC. You had to stay 5 nautical miles away from aerodromes, airports, even registered aerodromes, even water aerodromes, or any other aerodrome. You had to stay 5 nautical miles away unless you had an SFOC. With the new restrictions that we've just gone through, you can see that far fewer SFOCs are required, which means that it's more predictable, I'll say, in terms of an operation, particularly for folks that are doing commercial work. There's a very much reduced radius of restriction in terms of the military aerodromes and certified airports and heliports. Used to be 5 nautical miles, now it's 3 nautical miles. Now you still do need an SFOC for military aerodromes, but that's the only one. For certified airports and heliports, you merely talk to the operator of that facility and make sure that you're following their instructions. And in the case of non-certified aerodromes and even aerodromes that are outside of the CFS, there are basically no restricted areas other than staying out of the air traffic patterns and staying away from aircraft, but no specific geographical layouts that are banned. But you do still need to have sensible operations when you're flying in these areas. So it can be kind of difficult to visualize that. So I thought I'd take an example. Now, I kind of regret using this example because it turned out to be pretty complicated. But this is an image that I snapped out of the UAV selection site selection guide website. The red areas, and this is for prior to June 1st, the darker red areas are airports and heliports. So you have to stay 5 nautical miles away from the centers. And you can see a few yellow circles. There's one here. This is the controlled airspace for Winnipeg Airport. And there's another one, you can barely see it here. And there's a couple of, I think these are class F, I didn't look too carefully, airspaces around here, and there's a little wedge up here as well. So a lot of red, let me put it that way, around Winnipeg prior to June the 1st. Now, with the new regulations in effect, only these blue areas are actually, I'll say, restricted in some way. So St. Francois Xavier and whatever this one is down here, and Deacon's, I don't remember what this airport is, but whatever this airport is, these are no longer restricted areas at all. They're non-certified aerodromes. One of these is a glider aerodrome, in fact. In the case of the 2 major airports that are listed here, the restriction, or what I call the radius of restriction in this little note here, is very much reduced from 5 nautical miles to 3 nautical miles in radius, and the heliport goes down from 3 nautical miles to 1 nautical mile. I don't guarantee that these circles are to scale, I just drew them by hand, these blue ones, but you can see the idea. It's very much less restricted area. I do want to emphasize that the controlled and restricted airspaces remain exactly the same. I think, as I said, these are class F, and these yellow outlined circles with the slightly lighter blue are the controlled airspaces around those airports. They stay the same, but the radius of restriction around the actual certified airports is reduced, and a lot of those aerodromes are no longer a restricted area. Pretty important. So when these new maps come out and the app comes out, we'll be able to see how this looks for areas that you and I fly around frequently. So there we have it, an explanation of the new restrictions around aerodromes, airports, controlled airspace, restricted airspace, certified airports and heliports, water aerodromes, and everything in between. Thank you very much for staying through this. Please like and subscribe below, and I'd love to hear your comments. Thank you again for your time.